Hi everybody and welcome along. Today we are going to paint a really cool landscape scene of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's another request from my patrons. If you would love to be able to come along and ask me to paint something specific, then all you need to do is check out the episode notes below for the link for all the details of joining my Patreon, and you can join up from anything from £2 a month and get loads of extra interactive watercolour content from me and loads more access to me to ask me questions about your paintings. It's pretty good. So if you're enjoying watercolour, it's well worth checking it out, especially as we're starting to go back to school in September. Maybe for you, this is the perfect opportunity to start to get a bit of time back for yourself. So for now, we're going to do the Blue Ridge Mountains, so grab your paints and let's get started. The Blue Ridge Mountains are part of the Appalachian mountain range, and these lovely mountains were brought to my attention by one of my patrons, as I said. So we're going to do a piece. So what I've done a slightly different masking off technique here today. I have made my painting space smaller just by masking in on the paper, but making sure it overlaps onto the outer edges so it stays put. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in a bit of my mountain range. What this is going to be really useful for is sort of depth and distance and perspective, but also how to create a variation of shape when you've just got this sort of a mountain range that's sort of distant, far away, and you're like, well, how do I make this interesting in terms of a painting? Now, this drawing I'm doing, you can just watch me do it, and then once I have finished putting in all these lines, why not just pause the video, take a screenshot, and then you've got your very own printable. So these bottom two sections here are more green, the way the light hits the trees in my reference photo, and then we've got a much more blue feel up here, and then off in the distance we've got some very distant mountains and the sky. So I'm tempted to actually put in a wash across the whole piece. Last week I painted some tomatoes and did some underpainting where I started off with yellow and then I worked in a blue wash, and it was a really interesting way of showing how underpainting can affect the general mood of the piece. Now I'm going to really bring in the yellow down here on my mountains in the foreground. I've got yellow in the distance, and then I'm going to take a bit of French ultramarine blue, and I'm going to place in that wash through the centre of the piece. They are the Blue Ridge Mountains after all. And this is going to just fill in the section of mountains that is the sort of the main part that I can see, which is more in shadow, and we've got a bit more in sunlight here. And then off in the distance we've got more of the sky, a lovely glowing sky, and then I will just paint in a very faint bit of blue for these distant mountains here. And this will also help in terms of teaching, just being able to convey which bit I'm talking about. Whilst the painting is still a little bit damp, we're going to look at the sky. So I've got some Payne's grey here, which I'm diluting right down, and then I also want some highlight colour, a warm colour. So if I get some yellow ochre and a bit of cadmium orange, I've got two contrasting approaches. So I'm going to try putting in some highlights first into the sky. So using my size 4 brush, I'm just dabbing the brush at sort of these sort of curvy strokes, putting in, there's a lovely cloudy sort of effect in the sky whilst it's still just a little bit damp, but it's only a tiny bit damp, which is great because it means that I can then fairly swiftly get some Payne's grey on my brush and get in here and just contrast some of those lighter bits with a few sweeps of a low light. It's very important not to sort of overwork your clouds. Now, I know clouds can be a bit mystifying, can't they? Like, well, I don't really know what I'm doing. Well, keep it light. Don't sort of overwork the piece. Keep your brush sort of moving. And what I find is this will dry. It'll look a little bit different in a minute, and I might then go back in with some more colour once it's started to dry itself. But for now, we're happy with that, to leave it. The rest of the page does need to dry more fully so that we can start to place in our details of all the amazing coverage of trees and forest over these Blue Ridge Mountains. This has had a little bit of drying time, and we're going to work from the back to start off with. And I've got some Payne's grey and a size 0 brush, and I'm going to paint a little bit and clean my brush off and then just blend it downwards. So paint a little bit, and you can sort of add in slightly more of a mountain range. And I think I might actually get my larger brush quickly in play to just help smooth that down. These distant mountains look amazing. They're almost disappearing into the clouds. We'll let that dry, do another, well, we can let that dry and we can do another little layer later on, but for now we can actually get stuck in with our proper mountains. So there's sort of a lot of highlight which then sinks down into the depth of the mountains themselves. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin, and I'll do an example here. We're actually going to begin with green gold on the top there, and I'm going to use it sort of on the top to create any kind of ridge that I want to make a point of. And then, whilst that's still a little bit wet, we're going to start to introduce in some slightly deeper colours. So here I have some sap green mixed with Payne's grey and burnt sienna. Then I've just got Payne's grey on its own and burnt sienna just sat up there on its own as well. And I'm going to start to carefully paint in between whilst it's still wet. This first sort of green sludgy colour. You can see how that the green gold is just standing out on its own. If you want to give it a bit more help, you can do. If you want to put another bit in, it sort of sticks out quite well, the green gold, and then you can just paint carefully around it, building up that texture. And then, whilst it's all still damp, so you have to have your colours ready in advance, and that's what we've done here, a little bit of burnt sienna coming down in. And then lastly, right down in the depths, some Payne's grey. So we're just trying to create that sense of all the sort of light and shade that hits the mountains, and then the texture of all those trees all over the mountains there. I mean, whilst I dab my brush, you see it's all fading into the hill, and it's not really making a huge amount of impact, but it is just doing a little bit of helping build up that texture. I've also got Moon Glow in my palette, which is a nice additional low light colour. So I'm just chucking a little in up the dark points. And that's created a really lovely sort of mountain ridge, which is what we're going to repeat in all of these sections here. So I'm trying to let each mountain range dry before I place in the next one, just to allow me the chance to get some kind of sort of definition between the two, whilst also working quite wet like this. You can also, you know, while you're waiting for things to dry, look across the painting and see what else you could do. I added in a few more distant mountain ranges. But it's lovely how it just starts to slowly appear, these little mountain ranges. And of course, you know, once it's dry, you can always go back in and add in extra bits, but isn't it nice to be able to achieve effects just by using watercolour in its purest form like this? Whilst that's all drying, we can look down at the foreground, which is much more green. And so we will start still with our green gold, but this time, instead of introducing too many bluish tones, I'm going to introduce yellow ochre and cadmium yellow. In here before I then put down any shadowy mixes. So cadmium yellow, just sort of, I think on the tops, just hitting the highlights. Cadmium yellow is a strong opaque watercolour paint, so it can be sort of painted into deeper colours and sort of have a slightly decent attempt at holding its own. So I'm now, once I've put in these warmer colours, I'm going to go back to my deeper greens and start to place that in the same way I did for the other mountains. Let it dry and then we can put in the others. So these foreground hills are painted in, and what I'm going to do, they're still a bit damp. What I want to do now, just to finish off the piece, is actually to take a small brush and just paint in a few little sort of trees that are actually just sort of sitting in the landscape, with a bit of Payne's grey, sap green, and just create a bit more texture and a bit more of a sort of story for the piece itself. And that's also why it's extremely important to have allowed the area behind it to have dried. But you can see the area in front is still quite wet, and that's absolutely fine. In fact, it's quite nice because it sort of blends down into it really well. And I don't know if you've even glanced at the sky on the painting since we began, but don't you think it doesn't need anything now? When you have a chance to work into other things, and it's amazing how actually pieces just need a little bit of time to be left on their own to settle in. And there you have your painting of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Let's peel away the masking tape. Oh, what a lovely crisp edge. That's always satisfying, isn't it? So there you have a lovely landscape vignette of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed that. We have loads more landscape paintings of all sorts. I love to paint quite small, and so when I tackle landscapes I always feel a little bit intimidated by the idea of large expanses, and I've found it a really helpful way to get into landscape painting by just scaling down the size of page you're going to work on, and then by all means build yourself up into larger pieces. But for now I'll say thank you. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to the channel. It makes such a difference to us, and of course we are forever grateful to your support. Let me know how you got on with it, and I'll see you again next time. Bye!